Well, good morning. Committee will come to order. Good morning. I'd like to welcome Chief Tony Took of the U.S. Forest Service to the subcommittee. This is the first appearance as a chief in the Interior Environment Subcommittee hearing. We look forward to your testimony today and working with you in the future. The subcommittee's oversight of annual supplemental appropriation requests as well as the spending decisions of the agencies under its jurisdiction is critical to ensure taxpayer funds are used appropriately and wisely. We hold this hearing to review the fiscal year 2018 hurricane supplemental appropriations request for the Forest Service as was submitted to this committee by the Office of Management and Budget on November 17th. Before we get into the details of the request, first I must express my admiration and appreciation for the service staff, especially those affected by this year's hurricanes and fires. Their determination to rebuild and their willingness to carry on in tough times are what make the Forest Service a truly great agency. Chief, your staff in Washington was most helpful to the subcommittee as we sought information on how this year's hurricanes and fires affected Forest Service facilities, programs, and activities. My staff and I could not do our work without them. I specifically want to call out Sherry Elliott for her work as acting budget director for the past 1.5 years. She'll be leaving D.C. soon and heading back to sunny California. For that, I can't blame you, but we'll miss you.
Was it something we said or did?
She's been an immense help in improving the service's accounting, budgeting, and financial management systems and protocols. Her work ethic and legacy will work on and live on in your new acting budget director, John Rapp, and ensure the service has a sound financial foundation for the 21st century. So Sherry, thank you for all you've done for us here in the last number of years. The Forest Service requests $96,652,000 for a variety of activities to help our national forests recover from Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. These activities include debris removal, stream cleanup, rebuilding facilities, repairing roads and bridges, providing technical assistance to states, and provide forest land owners to support their cleanup efforts and control invasive species. Most of the requests, approximately $81 million, is needed to Puerto Rico for the El Yunque National Forest, I get that right, and the International Institute of Tropical Forestry. El Yunque is unique in that it's only tropical rainforest in the national forest system. The forest is special, and the Institute does important work for the tropical forests around the world. These places are well worth the effort needed to repair and restore them. As we review the supplemental appropriations request, we'll be keeping our eyes open for duplicative efforts, a demonstration of a clear role for the federal government, safeguards against waste, fraud, and abuse. We'll also want to discuss the outlook for recovery in the affected forests and whether or not supplemental funds may be needed in the future. Again, thank you, Chief, for being with us today. Before we turn to you, I'm going to yield to my friend and colleague, our ranking member, Ms. McCollum, for any remarks she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I am very happy to join the chairman and welcome you this morning to your first public hearing before this committee. Congratulations on your new position. And Sherry, we wish you all the best in the years ahead in warm California. I say that being from Minnesota this winter. Chief, as the chairman pointed out, you have an impressive background, and I think the depth of your experience across different areas of the Forest Service will provide a wonderful foundation for your new role. And as the chairman pointed out, today we are discussing the details of the administration's most recent request, the supplemental appropriation. This request is to identify needs to fund and address the historic widespread destruction caused by hurricanes and wildfires to parts of our country earlier this year. Sadly, the Trump administration's last supplemental request, however, falls short in many areas, including education, health, and housing. And I am very concerned that the Trump administration will see the suffering of the people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands continue, and they'll have to even wait longer to rebuild their homes, their lives. As specific to your agency, I find it disappointing that the request only includes a passing reference to the wildfires in the West and did not request any funding to deal with the aftermath of their devastation, something I'm sure this committee will discuss in depth. And I believe the Forest Service should be conducting post-fire restoration work, and I hope today we can have a productive discussion about what work would look like and how it would benefit the forest and what we can do to be part of that. I also believe that Congress needs to seriously consider providing funds for fuel reduction and restoration projects to treat additional areas for hazardous fuels. I know with the backlog that's accumulated, it's all over the country. The supplemental request for the Forest Service is $97 million, and these funds are for restoration work in the National Forest System to assist state and private landowners in assessing damage and conducting restoration. The hurricanes caused profound damage in the natural landscape, and tragically, El Yucca rainforest, as the chairman pointed out, really is a national treasure. It was decimated, and the catastrophic destruction to this forest will cause long-lasting harm to the ecosystem and to the economy of the island. I look forward to hearing more from you today about the specific requests of the Forest Service plans to accomplish in recovery and reforestation. I'm also interested in hearing your perspectives on the timeline and the challenges ahead and how we can work together to achieve our mutual goals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I mentioned to the gentlelady that I was up in California, Mike Thompson's district, during the break. Met with some of the chief's folks up there and local firefighters, state CAL FIRE, and it was truly a devastating event. And we're going to be working with everyone, with you, to make sure that California is not forgotten on all these disasters. This has been a tough disaster year, probably the toughest since I've been in Congress, maybe the toughest in the history of the United States. And so we have a big challenge ahead of us as we try to rebuild these areas, not just in the hurricane area, but with wildfire in the West, we know as much of a catastrophe as a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake. However, unlike any, we're going to get your opening statement, and I'll get into that more specifically. But I just wanted to talk about what is happening in California. With that, Chief, you're recognized.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, really appreciate you inviting me here to testify on the President's request for supplemental funding for the Forest Service in response to the 2017 hurricane season. It's really an honor to be here today. We are deeply appreciative of the support that we always receive and continue to receive from y'all. We're especially appreciative of your long-term support to find a fire funding solution and to work with us on repayment of fire transfer. Having spent several years in 4 of the southern states in the southern coastal plain, I'm very familiar with response to hurricanes. For example, in 2004, we had multiple hurricanes in the state of Florida when I worked there, and then in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Last year, in 2017, we had 3 hurricanes in rapid succession that struck the south, both the islands of the Caribbean as well as Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. From the 3 hurricanes that you mentioned previously, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The hardest hit was the Hurricane Maria. This was a Category 4 storm that struck Puerto Rico on September the 20th. It toppled trees, power lines, damaged facilities, infrastructure, homes, businesses, communities, more than 30 inches of rain. There was very much widespread flooding. Experts say, and what I've read and been told, is this is the most devastating storm to hit the island since 1932. Damage to Maria from Maria also included natural resources on the 30,000-acre El Yunque National Forest, the administrative buildings there, roads, trails, bridges, popular tourism spots on the forest, heavily damaged the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, which is a research unit there. We have about 90 employees there that have suffered heavy losses from their homes, the communities, their lives have been impacted. This storm has been, had a personal, me personally, I was the regional forester there for almost 3 years. I was in the process of transitioning to this job as chief whenever this particular storm struck. And so I know many of the employees personally, both on the forest and there at the Research Institute, as well as a few members of their families. So I'm very much personally committed to this recovery, as I would be for any employees anywhere from a hurricane or fire or the citizens that we serve. So our first part of the response focused on employee welfare. We did a lot to locate our employees. This took up to 2 weeks to locate all 89 employees that we have at the research unit and there on the forest. We had daily calls with the forest supervisor and the station director using satellite phones. We optimized the flexibilities and authorities that we have to try and improve, for our employees to be able to get the basics of life, a hot meal, supplies, drinking water, and get back to normalcy as soon as possible. We also answered the call to support FEMA. We do that, and in Puerto Rico, for example, we've had incident command teams deployed. We've had crews that help reopen roads, help remove downed trees and power lines, clear debris. This was pretty difficult in some of the mountainous communities there. We also supported the distribution of meals, supplies, and water. We've had law enforcement officers there continually for public safety. And we did all of this while we continued to support a record-breaking fire season in the West. As you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, our employees have literally been in some type of emergency response since October of 2016 when fires began down in the southern Appalachian Mountains. So while other states that sustained damage are returning to normal more quickly, it's going to be a longer haul there in Puerto Rico, for example, for the El Yunque Forest and the research unit. Real quickly, I want to talk just a little bit about the role that the forest plays there on the island. It very much contributes to the economy and the quality of life there. Tourism economy, it's a popular destination spot, welcomes about 1 million visitors per year, contributes $6.5 million to the local economy, provides 20% of the drinking water. Water production is estimated to be about $25 million annually from the forest. So this rebuilding effort is going to help restore our abilities to do that. Employees are rebuilding their lives slowly. Some of them have had to make tough choices as the schools are not open. They remain closed. I know one employee, for example, a mother, sent her child here to the mainland to resume school attendance. My acting associate chief and the acting regional forester for the southern region are on the way to Puerto Rico right now to visit with our employees firsthand and also get a look at the long-term recovery efforts. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing what they report back. We're turning our full attention to the recovery of the forest and the facilities. We've requested $96 million. 80% of it's going to go to Puerto Rico. We have forest in the other 5 impacted states, but there's a lot of work ahead, especially in Puerto Rico, that fits with our national priorities, from rebuilding infrastructure, roads, bridges, administrative sites, recreation sites, doing erosion control, repairing these tourist spots, repairing the offices, and assistance to the states and private landowners for different things. And we'll very much continue to support our employees in every way possible, as well as the citizens. And also, this is part of this will go to resuming our research work there, for example, at the Institute. So we deeply appreciate your support on this long road to recovery on these forests in the South, and particularly in Puerto Rico. It means a lot to our agency. It means a lot to our employees. It means a lot to the citizens. It means a lot to me personally. So thank you, Chairman Calvert, for providing me with the opportunity to appear before you today. Look forward to working with this subcommittee on the supplemental request, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your opening statement. As we discussed, it's really been a horrible year for natural disasters. However, unlike any other area in the world, I think the United States, we respond and we rebuild. And so in that vein, have all the damage assessments related to hurricanes been completed?
We've completed preliminary assessments. The southern region has developed a 12-month draft recovery plan that we will continue to update, but preliminary assessments have all been completed. I would expect that by the end of the calendar year, or very early 18, we'll have more sound estimates, and then we'll update that as guided by this recovery plan over the next 12 months. And some things, you know, may not be found for 3 to 5 years, but we think we'll be able to get the majority of the assessment work done and refined in the first 12 months.
As it regards to damage assessments of this year's fires, have they been completed also?
The majority of the damage assessments on the post-fire recovery work, I think, in most of the western regions are done. I can't say that for sure, but I think we're already into some of that recovery work as well, the post-fire recovery work.
Do you expect any other additional assessments? What we just talked about?
Not that I'm aware of, unless we get surprised by something that we don't know about, and this request is just for the damages from the hurricanes.
Okay, and finally, do you expect additional funding may be necessary after this supplemental to get back to normal order?
We feel like this request of $96 million will cover the needs, and like I said, unless there's something that surprises us later that we don't anticipate right now, but we think this will cover the needs.
Real quickly on these fires in Santa Rosa fires. For the record, can you describe the Forest Service's role in extinguishing those fires?
We work with California, with CDF. We have agreements. We work through our incident command system. We work with the federal and state partners and locals through that system, and we definitely supported it. We stayed as long as they needed us. I think at one time, I may have to correct this, but I think we had as many as 1,600 Forest Service employees supporting that effort.
Right. I was there, and thank you for that, and the local folks, thank you, in the state of California. One thing that we're concerned about, obviously, on top of the debris removal, is watershed protection. And if California's luck, we'll have we need the rain, but it'll be on top of these wildfires, and those hillsides, as you know, are totally denuded of any vegetation. So very concerned about that.
Yes, sir. And, it's not just a problem on national forest, it's a problem everywhere with fires. I think there's an article this morning talking about the fires there and the impacts from California.
Right. Thank you. Ms. McCullum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to, and I appreciate, once again, you sharing the stories of the employees. I read your full testimony, and it's heartbreaking. Because they're expected to get out and do a job and do assessments and take care of their families at the same time as your testimony pointed out, stand in line waiting for gas to get to work and just do the basic day-to-day things that all of us have to do. So please let your employees know that we're thinking of them. So in your supplemental, in looking through and the questions that the chairman was asking, like, do you think there's going to be other things coming forward that we're going to need? I mean, I'm looking at things in, that's part of your testimony, like replace equipment, radios, networks, telephones, computers, printers, plotters, copiers. You're going to have to go back out and resurvey land and market, both in Florida and Puerto Rico. And now it looks like in Florida alone, you lost over 50% in the one of the national forests. It damaged to the extent that it's no longer marketable on timber sales, which affects your projected revenue stream into the future. Do you have, at this point, because there's such an urgency to deal with the emergency, and then kind of triage that your employees go in and do. And with invasive species and everything like that, it's going to be, as you pointed out, maybe 3 years before we know everything in there. So I think that we should seriously be expecting another supplemental request or something in the future budget request that's going to be a significant increase to the Forest Service, because you must have only begun to start printing out on a spreadsheet what all these things are going to cost as you continue to find things. Is that correct?
Well, based on what we know right now, and we've got experience with responding to storms, hurricanes, and so we use that experience in these estimates. And I don't anticipate us requesting any additional funding beyond this $96 million. But as we go through this next 12 or 9 months, we're now into the 12-month recovery plan that they laid out. We could find something that we don't know about or didn't anticipate, but based on what we know right now, we won't need any more than this.
Well, certainly if you find something, I for one, and I won't speak for the entire committee, but I'm kind of thinking they'd probably agree with me, would encourage you to come forward, and we really would not be shocked, surprised, or disappointed if you came through and asked for some more. I'd like to touch just for a second on the state and private forestry, because that's one of the things that Forest Service, and I will also say one of your partner agencies, Fish and Wildlife, is noted for, and that is hand in hand working with local partners, working with private people in the private sector. Your request for that is only $7.5 million for the forestry. So how much of that is for damage assessment and technical assistance? And does that reflect the total need, and does that reflect California?
It just reflects the need for the assistance for the hurricane recovery in those southern states that I mentioned in Puerto Rico. And it's the $7.5 million. $6 million of it will go to providing technical assistance to private landowners or to states for like land management planning, for like doing stewardship planning, for doing assessments, for doing damage assessments. $1.5 million will go to things like assessing forest threats or invasive species and mitigation efforts for those. So those are the kind of activities that the $7.5 million for state and private will go for.
And I know the chair will follow up with questions either today or in the future on the California wildland fires. So this doesn't include, if I heard you correct, anything for state and private forestry. Does the supplemental request anything for post-fire restoration needs? I have not seen the devastation in California, but I've been around a few forest fires in my life, and know that there's a lot of activity that needs to happen with restoration. And if not, when will we have an idea of what you need for invasive species, noxious weeds, restoration of soils? When do you think the timeline would that be so that California can start its recovery?
So on the this request is just for the hurricanes, and we're using the funding that we already have for the post-fire work, whether it's on national forest or whether it's through technical assistance for state and private lands.
So then if I'm hearing you correctly, for this devastating fire in California, you're taking out of what has already been allocated to do your day-to-day workload, what has been maybe anticipated for wildland fires, you're taking that out of the regular budget, which I would think would create more backlog for doing fuel reduction and restoration projects not in other areas. Would that not be correct?
We have quite a backlog of work, both on forest management work, across the board. And so what we have to do with our current funding is set priorities based on the information we have and based on the assessments that we make. And so that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Chief, and Chair, to the Chair and to the committee members. I think this has been an ongoing issue which we've all been trying to deal with. And so Mr. Simpson's fire bill, as well as increasing funding to the Forest Service, I think would help with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if that's on or off. What the hell? Dave decided he wasn't going to connect my microphone because I talked. No, I'm just kidding. So following up on what the ranking member just said, to get this straight, the 97 or 96, whatever million it is, supplemental that's requested here is only for the hurricanes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. We've mentioned Puerto Rico a lot when we talk about this. So far, I haven't heard any mention of Virgin Islands. Do you have any role in the Virgin Islands?
Yes, we do.
Is it significant there?
Not like Puerto Rico, but there is some there. And then the other two states that would be probably the most impacted besides Puerto Rico are Texas and Florida.
Okay. Getting back to the supplemental request, I am a little concerned that we're using existing funds in the appropriation to address the wildfires. That's been a complaint that we've had for a long time. You haven't had a choice but to do that. And I will say I want to thank you and your staff for the help you've been in trying to do this wildfire fix that I've been working on for 4 or 5 years, and I think all the members of this committee have also. It seems like we have, I'm hopeful we're going to get it done this year, and it seems like we have some agreement between leadership in the House and the Senate and so forth that we need, that a budget cap adjustment is the right way to go instead of some of the other alternatives that other people have looked at. The one thing that seems to be missing is the need to address the 10-year average. Could you explain to us what the importance of addressing the 10-year average as we do this fire fix, hopefully get this fire fix done?
So we need a fire funding fix that addresses the rising cost of the 10-year average and then treats natural disaster fires like natural disasters where the funds come from some other money besides our regular appropriations that affect our other programs of work, including the ability to manage forests to reduce the risk of fire. The 10-year average is rising. And this past year, for example, we're now over 55% of our budget going to fire suppression. So mathematically speaking, in recent years, we're adding very costly fire season years to that 10-year average. And then some of the years way back there that were less costly are dropping off. Fire seasons are longer, the conditions are worse, and the costs are going up like those. So if the 10-year average continues to rise against basically what's been a flat budget for us, then it affects our other programs, including the ability to manage forest. Right. For example, 80 million acres of the National Forest System is currently at moderate to high risk of insect disease or fire. A third of that would be rated at very high risk. And so that takes our, reduces our ability to be able to address those risks and reduce the risk of fire. Do you have those maps? I brought a couple of maps with me. I like maps. And
I like any pictures.
One of these shows the wildfire risk map. The other one's the insect and disease. And so, what I would like to have is an increased ability to address these different risks. But these maps, that's the wildfire one, and this is the insect and disease one. But basically, the brighter the color, the higher the risk. That's basically what that amounts to. So you can see a good picture of the problem.
I know.
So essentially what you're saying is if we don't address the 10-year average, that 55% is going to continue to grow.
Yes, sir.
55% of your budget.
And according to our projections, even if we have a low to moderate fire years the next few years, it's going to grow over $500 million over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
The 10-year average will grow by that much.
So while doing the budget cap adjustment is an important step, addressing the 10-year average is a necessary step in trying to do the full how we're going to fix the wildfire funding.
It will be a great help.
Okay. One last question. I'm under the impression, and I just was wondering if it's true, that when you go out and do like a timber sales, there's a requirement that you do reforestation and that kind of stuff, that timber companies do reforestation and stuff, but there's no requirement that after a wildfire you do reforestation. I mean, you can as funds are available, but there's no requirement in the law that you do reforestation.
Yes,
is that true?
but we do assessments and we set priorities, and then we try to reforest as we get the resources to do it.
Would it be helpful to have to change the statute so that you had to do reforestation after wildfires? Because I'm as worried as Ken is about what's going to happen after these wildfires, and all of a sudden the rains come and the snows come, and pretty soon all of that material ends up in my local rivers.
Well, yes, and the more resources we have available to do the work, we will reforest much more quickly.
Okay, thank you, and be sure and pass along to all your employees from this committee how much we appreciate the work that they're doing, and echo what the chairman said.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, on a question on the map really quick. So I'm looking at the insect and disease risk map, and then I'm looking at the potential for the contiguous 48. So do you see if we are able to address what's happening with the insect and disease, do we have the potential of changing the map that's showing where the potential risks for wildfires are?
Yes, it won't be the same everywhere, but what our science, data, and monitoring shows, whenever we do thinning, for example, and reduce hazardous fuels, about 85 to 90% of the time, sometimes more, we positively affect the fire behavior and lower the catastrophic risk of fire damage when we do those treatments.
Thank you.
So getting that right, timbering operations in those areas help the health of the forest.
Yes, sir. I'll use every tool that we have available to us, every authority we have available, from timber sales to non-commercial hazardous fuels reduction to managing natural wildfire ignitions to doing prescribed burning. We need to use sometimes a combination of those tools.
I want to recognize Mr. Kilmer, but I couldn't help but recognize that when I'm looking at this wildfire map that there's nothing left in the west if things caught on fire. And so we got to get on this as quickly as possible. Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for being with us. I actually want to follow up on something Mr. Simpson asked. So if Congress fails to take action on whether it be his bill or some form of his bill, do you have a number of what percentage of your budget will end up going to this fire piece?
So we had a projection that it would be 67% by the year 2025, but that was updated because conditions have changed. And they didn't change in our favor. And based on the projections we have right now, we're going to be at that 67% in 2021. That's 4 years. less than 4 years.
Okay. In your testimony, I think you do a good job of laying out what the priorities are on the disaster front and why those investments are needed. I guess I'd just be curious, I want to ensure that communities recover. I also want to make sure that you're able to execute on the other missions that you have, whether that be road maintenance or forest management or what have you. So what happens if Congress doesn't provide the supplemental funding that the agency's asked for?
We will have to really look at our priorities, and we'll have to prioritize the work. And we may have to take money away from another forest or another place or another community. We will go through that kind of thinking and that kind of process. I feel like there's nothing that we do that's not important, but we will have to put resources toward what we feel like is the most important at the time.
Do you have a sense already as to what will suffer if Congress fails to act on your request?
Well, for example, the Puerto Rico, if we don't provide some resources there, there's going to be a lot of, the forest is going to remain closed. It's going to have a huge impact to the local economy. Like I said earlier, for example, the forest contributes $6.5 million to the local economy, and the drinking waters, 20% of it comes from the forest, and then annually there's about $25 million in water production. So those are some examples of things that would be mightily impacted.
Thank you. Thanks, Chairman.
Mr. Amodei.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I don't want to beat actually in this committee I can't use the phrase dead horse. I don't want to keep repeating things, but I want to make sure that the $96 million is for hurricane assistance recovery. There's no capital improvement, anything else like that in there. You're fixing stuff that was there before, whether it's resource or capital improvement related, right?
No, sir. It's for the repairs, for the rehabilitation, for the recovery as a result of these storms.
Okay, I wasn't clear. We're not upgrading or adding to Forest Service assets. We're fixing what existed the day before the storm.
Yes, sir. This is not building anything new or bringing something new to the table.
Okay, and then when you said assistance for different things, that's still limited by what you said and what Mr. Simpson's thing said, hey, the $96 million is for hurricane stuff.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I also want to compliment you because it's hard not to get onto things that the ranking member and other members have talked about in the West. I understand that my colleague from Ohio is there, and there are things that actually exist east of the Mississippi that are part of this country, and I look forward to learning more about those at some point in time. London? But anyhow, I've noticed when you talk about what you're planning on doing as far as triaging, for instance, in Puerto Rico, that looks like a pretty good starting blueprint for when we talk about how you triage those disaster areas that are elsewhere and from different natural disasters in terms of whether it's fire, whether it's flood, whether it's whatever. So I just wanted to say, it's like, this looks like a pretty comprehensive look at an area that you folks have some responsibility in. And from an oversight or future thing, it'd be like, hey, when we come back, for instance, to talk about Northern California, it's like, so are we kind of looking at the same sort of stuff that happened in those circumstances as we have to what looks like a pretty comprehensive response to Puerto Rico? So I know part of that needs legislation, but forewarned is forearmed. And then the final thing is, and I know you probably didn't come to the hearing for that, but I'd be kind of curious to know what the property ownership ratio was for instance, the Northern California fire when we talk about Santa Rosa. How much of that was private versus how much of that was actually Forest Service ground? So we'll get back to your office on that. I just wanted to kind of give you a little heads up for your staff folks to give us an idea. And the reason that I'm asking that is because in my state, where 86% of it's owned by the federal government, not the Forest Service, mostly BLM, but when we talk about things like fires and suppression costs and who's responsible for what, who owns the property, gets to be a pretty important thing in terms of billing private entities and local governments in my state for federal fire suppression efforts on land that is not federal. So, full disclosure, we'll be kind of looking for that information, see how that works.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, as you know, in the West, we have these declared disaster areas. So as we do these supplementals, I think we do have some flexibility to help these communities. And especially right now with watershed, as Mr. Simpson mentioned, we don't want to have another disaster this winter. So I'm hopeful that we can work together to look at how we can resolve some of these watershed issues, because you can see this problem coming up this winter if we don't do anything. And some of these areas just don't have enough resources to deal with it. I think the gentlelady from Ohio is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chief Took. Really good to have you here. Thank you for your lifetime of service to our country. I'll disclose that when I was in college, there was something called a Cooter preference test, and I took it. And it was about what your career will be. Well, it wasn't Congress. They actually said I was most suited to be a forest ranger. So I feel very comfortable. I often do feel like I am in a forest, and not only do I not sometimes know what all the trees are, but I don't have a compass. And so I'm sure you have all the requisite skills necessary to help us repair what needs to be done for our country and our territories. I wanted to ask you, for Puerto Rico, I represent a vast Puerto Rican population living in Ohio, and I wanted to ask you approximately what percentage of the land area of Puerto Rico is national forest?
I don't have the percentage, but the forest there is 30,000 acres, if that gives you a little bit of an idea. So it's
30,000 acres.
It's
Okay,
fairly small, but
30,000 acres is a pretty, I mean, that's a sizable footprint.
it's big, not as big as our other national forests, most of them.
Right.
But
But Puerto Rico is just a little bit bigger than my congressional district in land area. So what would really be helpful as we think about spending money on I'm a land planner by training. It drives me crazy that we don't have maps like this for Puerto Rico. So if we sit on the Energy Committee and we're talking to the Army Corps of Engineers and we're looking at where power lines are, and then you've got forests, you know, we don't see how these things converge, so that we spend the money wisely and we try to build forward from whatever remains. Congressman Amadeo talked about triage. Well, Puerto Rico is declining in population. It has been for almost 2 decades. And, you know, there may be some communities that are depopulated, or where we could expand the forest if the people in Puerto Rico want to do that, if the leadership down there wants to do that. And we could make some really wise choices as we try to replant, for example. So if you have such maps available, or if FEMA has them, I don't think this committee's ever seen them, and it would be nice to know where we could do some extra good if we could better focus ourselves on a really helpful map. I wanted to also ask, do you know how many trees have to be removed and possibly replanted in Puerto Rico? Do you know that yet?
I don't know about the removal now. The El Yunque National Forest, it's the only tropical rainforest in the National Forest System. Typically, they will recover, reforest fairly fast after a storm event. And what will happen where, you know, there's a lot of damaged or downed trees where it creates a way for sunlight to hit the forest floor, the first thing that's going to come back is the understory, things like ferns and those kinds of things. And then it'll be followed by some of the trees. One of our big worries is the very rapid colonization of invasive species. And so that's something we're going to be looking out for. I don't have the list right in front of me, but there's 4 or 5 invasive species, including invasive trees, that we expect will come back. That's something that we will have to deal with. in the future. It won't be a short-term thing. We'll have to deal with that over a long period of time.
How many people are working in Puerto Rico now for the Forest Service or on contract to the Forest Service to clean up and replant? And are more people needed?
We have 89 of our own employees there. Some of them are able to come back and work more regularly than others. You know, it just depends on how they've been impacted. The facilities that they're trying to come back and work in are very impacted, so it affects, you know, how they can work in those. We have a lot of personnel down there supporting them. I don't have the exact count, but we can get back with you on that.
All right, and if you could produce a map, that'd be really
And
helpful.
we'll follow up on the map, too. Thank you.
Will we have a second round, Mr. Chairman?
I believe so. Maybe. We'll see how the time goes here. Mr. Joyce, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, if the gentle lady from Ohio would want to continue, I would give you some of my time.
You're really wonderful to do that. I wanted to ask about parochially for Ohio and Michigan. We don't light up red on any map here, but we have major problems. In places like Cleveland, which used to be known as Forest City, Ohio and Michigan have to replant 20 million trees. Congressman Calvert talked about California having 100 million stumps that have to be removed, trees that have to be removed. We got 20 million that have to be replanted because of the emerald ash borer. And we don't have a solution for that. So you're sort of the king of oxygen. We need these trees, and Michigan and Ohio are very, very impacted. As we fund Puerto Rico and the southern states and the western states, does that mean it comes out of the meager budget for other places in the country that need help? I mean, how do you look at Ohio and Michigan in your planning?
We definitely have forest health issues in the east. And you mentioned one of the major ones, which is emerald ash borer. There's also hemlock woolly adelgid is another example. And I think for emerald ash borer, for example, I know the past 2 or 3 years we've spent almost $500,000, I believe, in research and assessing forest health risk from that. So yes, it's important, and we're definitely working with the states. We're doing research and doing all we can to address the forest health issues in the east.
I just wanted to thank you, Congressman Joyce. We share Lake Erie, and we need trees because of runoff and watershed issues in our part of the country. Lake Erie is dying, and that's not an understatement. So not to have focused attention on, and it's like everybody's in charge and nobody's in charge. You know, USDA does a little bit, Forest Service does a little bit where it can, but the filtration that's necessary, we don't have the solution in this freshwater kingdom, and I just placed it on the record for you. I also would appreciate your comments on a bill I've introduced called the 21st Century Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps. I don't ask you to say it's a great bill or a bad bill, but based on your history, what could you recommend to me to improve it so we could put to work large numbers of Americans helping you to do your job? Thank you, Congressman
you.
Joyce. I hope to
I
reciprocate.
don't know if you have any time left. If you want to ask a quick question, go ahead.
Those were pertinent questions for Ohio, and I appreciate you following up on that, and I'll move on.
Okay, Mr. Jenkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick areas of inquiry. One, and I appreciate in your opening remarks, you referenced the fires in the Mon National Forest in West Virginia. I think in our previous discussion, there was, I raised just some anecdotal concerns about firefighting coordination between the National Forest and local partners, and making sure we have a seamless, when it's game time, when it's go time, who's allowed to do what. And I just raise the issue that anecdotally from some of the local partners, there's a little bit of a lack of coordination when that critical moment, most important, get on fire as quick as possible. Resources were left not engaged because of maybe some bureaucratic, this is our fire, we're going to fight it, we don't want you out here. So just raising the issue of something I'm concerned about, making sure we have good coordination. don't know if you want to comment on that, nor I can move on to
I
second.
do, and I appreciate you raising that. You know, for the most part, you know, almost all the time, we have excellent relationships on working with the states, the local governments, and volunteers, especially in the East as an example. And but I'm sure that every now and then we get some localized issues that we need to address, and I'll be sure and follow up
This would
on
welcome the
this one
opportunity to have
because
that, kind of that debrief, rather than Monday morning quarterbacking, Monday morning assessment
Right.
from a constructive, we know what'll happen again in terms of a fire. Let's make sure we're.
yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up because we want to make sure that it's ready to go, as you said, seamless before we get a fire. We need to work out any differences we have ahead of time.
And as you know from our previous discussions and my questions in this forum, always concerned about the engagement of the ability to allow appropriate, proper harvesting, having some ability to forecast timber sales moving forward. And the point I'd like to make, obviously, we've had a particularly destructive year because of fires around the country. Our forest products are as critical as ever, and we've got supply needs. And I'm a firm believer that we've not been harvesting in best practice management like that should have been done in the MON. And you have graciously, very much appropriately, in my opinion, said, yes, we're going to get this on the right track. And I guess one of my requests is, in addition to getting it on the right track in terms of the timber sales and the opportunity to harvest, trying to look at a longer term, not just a 1 year forecast, but trying to look 5 years down. As you know, our companies, folks who are gearing up, they need predictability. And having a moving target year to year, it does not make for good business practice forecasting. So my request is, if the Forest Service can give little clear indications, not only for the upcoming year, but for maybe future years, 5 years down the road, so people can adapt and plan. Any comments, reactions?
Yeah, thank you. So in the past 2 years across the country, we've treated more of our forest than any 2 year period in over 2 decades. So we're getting more done, but it's not nearly enough. When you look at those maps, it's not nearly enough. Specific, and that's across the country, not just in the West, but it's in the East, it's in the South. We need to get increased results and outcomes on the ground, including on the Monongahela. When I visited with you before and you shared some of the numbers that you had from the Monongahela, I went back and looked. And I know from fiscal year 14 through 16, and timber harvesting is one of the tools that we use to manage forest and reduce some of these risks. They were doing about 7 million board feet per year on an annual basis. And I appreciate what you're saying about long-term planning, because we have to have the infrastructure for us to be able to do forest management work to restore healthy, resilient forests. That's an important component. And looking through 2021, what the projection is, they did 11 million board feet in 17, and that's going to be almost doubled by 2021. So that's the pathway that they're on, and we definitely want to do everything we can to keep them on that.
Okay. Last comment, I probably overstayed my time, is in addition to being able to put these target numbers, that will be making sure that we have policies and practices that are allowed, required, that actually allow those numbers, or whatever the appropriate number is, to be achieved. I hear once again anecdotally that while that number might be a shiny object out there, what is imposed in the requirements and the limitations on how to get to that number make it economically infeasible. So it's the issue of, can you go in on the land? Do you have to do helicopter restrictions? These sorts of things. So I look forward to working with you, not only to get a number out there that is goal-oriented, but also a way to reach that is reasonable, realistically, and environmentally appropriate. So,
Thank you, and we will definitely do that.
thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and as a point that the gentleman brings up, it would be a shame to bring imports from Canada for timber, our friends from Canada, when thousands and thousands of homes in these disasters. We have plenty of timber here in the United States too. Obviously, we need to take advantage, put people to work, and at the same time rebuild our communities. Ms. McCullum?
Mr. Chairman, we're on the same track. I think in a future hearing, Chief, if you and the Forest Service could maybe apprise this committee of what our Canadian neighbors to the north are doing as far as fire mitigation, hazardous fuel reduction. I mean, they've had their fires too, because we've had the smoke in the Twin Cities now a couple of summers, and you know, it's really something when you can smell smoke from Canada in a metropolitan area in the middle of our state. That was just a suggestion. In the future, you can get back to the staff on that. And then I can't help but looking at this map and being all politics being local, looking at Minnesota right now with our Boundary Waters canoe area. You were talking about the tropical forest. This is the most heavily visited wilderness area. And once again, I just want to show my appreciation. I've heard from people all around the country and all around the world for the Forest Service taking a time out to do a study to make sure if we start doing this sulfite mining, which I hope we don't do, but and the stress all these mines leak that they put on the forest and the timber there, it would change this map dramatically. So thank you for moving forward with that study. And Chairman, I think we do need, you know, for economy, for these fires no borders, for us working together with Canada to suppress fires, for air quality, and that I think it would be very helpful to know what the Canadians are doing. And there's things we can work on and things we need to improve on so that we keep our forest industry well and alive. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Can I make a comment?
Certainly, go ahead.
I'll be meeting with my Canadian counterpart either in January or February, so I'll know a lot more.
All right.
Great. One last question. I have a couple of questions I'm going to submit to you for the record, but there was a story in the LA Times the other day, not that I listen to the LA Times very often, but in this case it made some sense. A simple but seldom used tactic to prevent wildfire, turning off the power grid when you have high winds predicted. Are you aware of that concept?
Not until recently. And we would support anything that, you know, reduces risk, but that would be something that would be left up to the local jurisdictions
So you've
to
never
make those.
consider recommending it to fire-prone areas that when you have a fire that you see coming, say in your area of jurisdiction, and you have power lines that where you may make a recommendation to turn them off?
We could provide information about fire risk and you know, what we know and from what our role is. And then it's left up to the local jurisdictions to balance that and what, you know, they'd have to make those decisions about whether to, for example, in this case, turn off power or not, and how to balance that out versus the risk.
Right. Well, that's a debate that's going on in the West now, as you can imagine, with this fires we had in Santa Rosa. They yet don't know that's the cause, but they suspect it to be the cause. And whether or not that can prevent catastrophic wildfire or help prevent catastrophic wildfire in the future. But But we have a lot of work to do. We appreciate your coming out here today, and we certainly appreciate Sherry's hard work for the United States government. I hope you enjoy your retirement in sunny California. You'll love it.
Visited one of my favorite spots, the San Francisco Bay Area. So.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. It's so.
And thank you for recognizing her, by the way.
Thanks.
No, she's a great person. We're going to miss her. So with that, there's no other comments. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.